Well, hi, welcome to Habitual Excellence. I'm Mark Graban. We're joined today by Alyson Gordon from Duke University Health System. Alyson, how are you?
I'm good, Mark. Good to see you. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here and sharing with us today. And you report to our guest from episode 15, Rhonda Brandon. So I want to point the listeners back to that episode if you'd like to hear her and other perspectives from DUHS. But Alyson, maybe first off, can you introduce yourself, share a little bit about your background, and maybe also tell us about some of the transition you've made in terms of what your role is?
Absolutely. So I currently serve as the Assistant Vice President for New Talent Strategies at Duke University Health System. And I'm responsible in that role for talent acquisition and talent strategies. And most recently, I was serving as the Chief Human Resources Officer at Duke Raleigh Hospital. So I was there for about 3 years prior to this role, which I've been in for about a month. And when I was at Duke Raleigh, I had the opportunity to kind of have a front row seat to some of the organizational changes we were leading to really develop everyone every day to see, solve, and share problems. And so I'm excited to talk about just some of my learnings and how I hope to apply some of those in a new role.
Yeah. Well, so can you talk, we'll get into that, but looking back at the role that you had at Duke Raleigh, can you elaborate on this goal of developing people so that everybody can see, solve, and share problems? What were some of the practical steps to try to help create that culture and build those capabilities?
Oh, yeah. So I think some practical things that we did, we set up tiered huddles to allow people a way to call out problems. And we helped people, talked a lot about problems maybe that we weren't used to seeing, and did some things to help teach us to see problems better. Like we regularly did Gemba rounds and safety walks. And I think really talked about problems in a new way that we were seeing and experiencing, and started to call each other out better when we were maybe using old ways to solve problems, and challenge each other to say, well, how might we think of this differently? And I think even the practice of using open-ended questions, learning more about our behaviors and how our behaviors really influence our outcomes in a way that we don't always think about when we think about different safety and things like that. So I think the things that stand out to me that were most impactful were doing Gemba rounds and going to where the work was really helpful to help us see problems differently. And then we can kind of go back and work with the coach to say, okay, now what does that tell us, and what do we do differently as a result?
What were you mentioned old ways of solving problems? What were some of the things that were uncovered? I think people get very accustomed to how they operate, and then there's an opportunity through coaching to maybe start seeing things differently. What were some of those old ways, and how did you try to help transition away from those?
I think some of the old ways are ordering more supplies, retraining and re-education. I think those are pretty classic. Oh, I told Mark, so we're good now. I told him. I sent an email. So, I think asking those questions, well, how do we know that will work? Or sometimes when people, feel strongly that is the solution, giving it time and saying, how is that working? Because sometimes that leads us to say, well, you know what, I actually don't know how that's working. Or it helps us to see it's not working, that didn't solve the problem. Because we're all kind of on this change journey at a different pace. And so we have to, I think, as leaders especially, we have to allow everyone their time to still come on the journey, but to get there in their own pace, kind of.
Yeah. And as leaders and people within the hospital were, embracing or working, with new methods for problem solving, what types of concerns came to you as the Chief Human Resources Officer?
Well, I'll be really honest. Initially, when we talked about, zero harm to patients and keeping patients safe, I kind of felt like, well, that's really great, but it doesn't apply to me because I do human resources. And so what was cool, I think, the more that I came to understand, and again, have these experiences going to see, and the more you say, well, what problems are in my world that we can learn to solve? We actually, as an HR team, decided to start huddling every day and calling out problems, and started looking at things that came up in our world. And what I found is that there's so many connections, and there is a lot of harm that comes up in our world to employees. When people miss a paycheck, when we have to change their start dates and they're starting a new job, any kind of bad news we're delivering, or anytime we have to redo things, there's so many opportunities actually to not only make our worlds easier and simpler, but to remove harm to people along the way. And that really does create, I think, that space and that experience to say, our people truly are important, and we're going to treat you that way. Having that true respect for every individual is a way that I think it showed up in HR. And everything's a journey, but I think about pay so often, because pay is central to work. And so like, what better way to show respect for every individual to make sure not only are you paid the correct amount, but to be paid on time, and to have what you need to do your job. I think those are just like core basic things that we can do better about.
I think it's really interesting the way you frame that in terms of a different type of harm. A lot of times we think of something like, a muscle strain or an accidental needle stick, physical risks. But yeah, my gosh, a lot of people, if they miss a paycheck, that creates all sorts of risk to them personally or to their families. Yeah.
And the other thing that came up, honestly, was it opened our eyes to understand our culture more too. Because as we're changing and shifting, you start to see some of those barriers and see what gets in the way. And understanding where we maybe didn't have all the professional safety we thought we did, or just where our culture was enabling the change and maybe sometimes slowing down the change a little bit too. And so again, from an HR perspective, thinking about what are the elements of our culture that we have an opportunity to change, to actually achieve the things we want to achieve. And how do we show up differently as leaders and adopt different behaviors to actually accomplish that. So that was another cool thing that we started talking about more, is if we really want to develop everyone every day to see, solve, and share problems, then how do you do that? And where do you start? And so at our executive team level, we were having a lot of opportunities to, have coaching and do reflection. And then we said, well, how do we share that with the next level of leaders? How do we spread this more? And so got to do an experiment actually, using A3 thinking, but really to say, well, where are those key places in the organization? Maybe you have influence, people that are close to the work often, but are not always in the work. Like I think about patient safety or infection prevention, right? I mean, infection prevention's whole job is about preventing harm. And so how do you look at key areas in the organization and helping them understand principles, helping them understand the behaviors, so that we say, if we really want to have the professional safety that enables us to solve these problems to root, then how do we even identify the specific behaviors that align with the principles? And then how do we teach people those behaviors in a way that they understand them, accept them, and can hold them accountable for that? So that, I think, is even just a different way of thinking about change. Normally we set big goals, we pull everybody in a room, and we train everybody, and we just roll things out, and we expect everyone to be on board. So I think that intentionality of saying, we're going to teach you something, and we're going to give you space to apply that learning, and then we're going to reflect together and assess what's different now. And people's level of understanding, I think, is a really interesting way to think about change, in a way that's not as common, but was really helpful, I think, because culture change is so often the hardest one. So to have that like real life test case was a lot of fun.
Can you share a little bit more? I guess I'm asking you to reflect on reflections. I like the way you framed this. It's not enough probably to get everyone together into a room, or nowadays maybe to do so virtually, sort of talk at people in terms of, here are the behaviors we would like to see more of. Here are different lean leadership principles. Here's how real-time problem solving works. But then there's that chance to do. And how do you set up a structure around coaching and reflections? Like, it seems like that could be time intensive. Who's doing that, and how? Can you share more about that?
Well, that's true. I mean, I think it is time intensive in some ways. And I think that it's also time well spent because of the rewards you get from it. And so when I think about what that looks like, one thing that was really clear to me is the practice of open-ended questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you do it, the more natural it becomes, and almost the simpler your reflection can be to coach people. And I think people think about coaching like, let's schedule an hour to sit down and coach. But there's real-time coaching that can occur, in a variety of scenarios and situations. And so some of the formal structural things we did was to say, okay, again, what's our plan and what are the reflection questions we're going to ask, and how will we know? But sometimes it was even saying, here's the elements or the principles that we are trying to draw out here. We're going to practice what that might be like, and just help people, again, start with awareness. How do I practice asking open-ended questions? How does that feel? What did I learn from this experience? And I think even just taking those 5 or 10 minutes with people helps, and having them experience it helps it become more natural and not feel like, oh, this is just a lot more work.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that question of how did this make you feel is an important one, because I think learning any new behavior is going to feel uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Leaders might not feel confident with, let's say, asking open-ended questions. So yeah, I think taking that pause and sort of asking people, how are you coming along with this? Because it's not like flipping a light switch to change behavior.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Correct. And I think even just to say, it probably will feel uncomfortable. It probably
just to acknowledge that, even
acknowledge it. It probably will feel uncomfortable, because I think, again, as leaders, we think, oh, we need to have the answers, and we're just going to go and talk to people and do this thing, and we'll have it all figured out. But I think even to say there's standard work, feel free to reference it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't feel pressure to kind of go off script, but use the standard that's created, and giving people permission to not be perfect.
Interesting.
We still strive for perfection, but to say, we're going to go into this interaction, we're going to have this conversation, and we're going to give it our best. And then we're going to learn from it. And then the next time it'll be even better. And giving people space to do that, I think, again, is a shift, because we don't always have to have the perfect answer, but we can't always be striving towards perfection.
Yeah. So that comes back to what you were talking about earlier. Not just old ways of solving problems, but just kind of the typical ways of behaving, those habits of, like you said, having all the answers or feeling pressured to telling people what to do, assuming something we put in place is going to be effective instead of testing and reflecting on it.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really important battles. And, I think, you talk about the aim, and one thing I've always been impressed with about Duke University Health System is this strong commitment to zero harm.
Mm-hmm.
So that sets the goal at an ideal state or a theoretical limit. And I think you articulated really well, this idea of we get closer to that goal of perfection by admitting our imperfections along the way.
Yeah.
That might seem counterintuitive to others.
Agree. And again, because it's vulnerability to say,
Mm-hmm.
I don't have it figured out, or I don't have it perfect. And so again, do you have the professional safety to be vulnerable? And then once we have that vulnerability, do we have the right structure, systems, tools in place to learn from that and improve it? So it's really, really powerful. And I think in healthcare, it is complex and it is hard, but how do we not wear hard like a badge? How do we get away from everything being hard and heavy and cumbersome, and make things simple and easy? And it's, again, different work, but it's not necessarily harder work or longer, more arduous work. It's just different. And that's truly, I think, once you can kind of get over that hump of like, it's just different, not harder or more, I think that it really can change the way that you approach how you can lead change to eliminate harm.
Yeah, it's interesting, this behavior of wearing something as a badge of honor is pretty common across different organizations. It could be leaders bragging about how long they are, how many hours a day they're spending. They're going above and beyond. And we can step back and question, well, why are you having to go above and beyond? Or staff members with workarounds, or you mentioned inventory earlier, stashing supplies in a secret place. Why should people have to do that? Are some of the things that we start recognizing, right? What are we
Yeah.
doing versus what should we be doing?
Correct. Yeah.
So let's talk more about your new role, and especially in talent acquisition, and how, realizing it's still a fairly new role, but I'm sure you're seeing all sorts of opportunities with fresh eyes to bring what you've learned into this role. Can you share a little bit about what you're seeing and what you're doing?
Sure. So it's really cool to kind of, I think, turn the page in a new role and say, okay, what are some of the learnings that I can bring with me? Because it really says, okay, if I want to lead with humility, I need to listen first. And so people are saying, what's your plan? What are you going to do? And I'm like, my plan is to listen and to show up and really listen with curiosity, not judgment, to take each bit of feedback seriously. And so that's kind of how I plan to start. And we've learned a lot about the process and where we have opportunities already. And some of that work has been done to identify where we have opportunities for improvement. But I think what I want to do is think about the whole process differently, start to finish, right? So where are the places that candidates are coming to know about us or kind of entering our system of sorts, right? Or knowledge of us. So how do they get into that candidate pool, that funnel? And how are we interacting with them at every part, every stage of that journey? And what can we do within that journey to reinforce what we believe to be true? That in a way that reinforces our values, in a way that shows respect for every individual. So just some of the things that come to mind are like our standard messages that you get from a system, right? If you apply for a job, it'll say, okay, it's been submitted. And this is a lot of places. But then you'll get an email in your inbox, in addition to the confirmation you saw on the website that says, it was submitted, we have your information, and you'll hear from us if we're interested, essentially. And so how do we change our communication to say, you know what, we're going to show respect for your time. We're going to have communication that's clear, that's engaging, that's friendly, not just vague and formal. How do we remove required steps from the process to be more efficient? Even creating more visibility to the process, I think, not hiding behind maybe like a generic inbox or, again, when people are looking for a job, a lot of times they feel like, well, I can't reach anybody. Who do I call? How do I get information? And so how do we just create visibility and transparency in a way that is respectful, I think, of people's intention and desire, and that also engages them throughout so that when they feel welcome, they feel wanted, they feel that respect. And regardless of the outcome, it leaves them with an impression that reinforces who they think we are and who we believe we are too. So those are just some of the things I think about. And I think when you really break down phases of the process, whether it's just the application piece or knowing about us, applying, interviewing, getting an offer, going through orientation, I think that we have opportunities to really, I think about respect for every individual more than anything through that process.
Well, it seems like there would be mutual benefit all around. So to the applicant or the job seeker, that they feel better, the process is less confusing, there's benefits to them. And then I imagine there are also benefits to the health system. If it's a competitive job market, the impression that the applicant is getting through the process might lead to a higher success rate when you're competing for talent. There's it sounds like a lot of opportunities, and it seems like rethinking the way we've always done it, meaning as the organization, or there's technology involved, and I imagine a lot of these standard platforms maybe have very standard language that it sounds like you're then personalizing to the Duke University health system approach and culture.
Absolutely. I even think about we tend to say, well, what are our competitors doing? And that's not the standard. I think the standard is something that is ideal, something that we would be proud of, something that sets the bar. And so when I think about what's the world we want to create and what should the future of talent acquisition look like at Duke University Health System, it should be something that is an ideal. It should not, that's what people already think of us. And so we should be able to match that with the process and the experience we create. And so that's, again, for me, it's exciting to think about. And it's not just one cycle of improvement or saying, how do we look good compared to our neighbors? It's much more than that.
Well, that sounds like a great adaptation of some of the other lessons from process improvement, real-time problem solving approaches that value capture teaches of, yeah, looking at the ideal. The ideal, as Duke articulates in other ways, is zero harm. It's not to be better than the competitors or to be in the top decile.
Right.
That thinking, it seems like now is really being extended there into talent acquisition. That's exciting.
Mm-hmm. It is. It's very, very exciting. So I'm excited and I'm honored to be part of this journey, and honestly to be at a place that feels like that's important.
And what are some other examples or opportunities? You know, you mentioned earlier the idea of harm. What are some things that happen that either in a way harm the job applicant or maybe end up harming the health system because of defects in the process or things that go wrong?
So, at times there are people get hired into roles and it's just not always the right fit for a variety of circumstances. So I think as we look at how people recover from that, how do we make it easy to still stay? So, okay, I got hired into this specific area. That wasn't where I needed to be, but there should still be a home for me if you have skills and, are aligned from a values perspective. And how do we make it easier for people to just stay? And I know every healthcare organization talks about retention, right? Everybody wants to keep their best talent. And so the other thing I think about is when people get to that point that they're ready to opt out, how do we continuously find ways to be re-recruiting them, to deepen their loyalty to Duke, and make it easy for them to stay by helping them find their next opportunity. So I know that's definitely something that we want to be thinking about looking down the line.
Yeah. So maybe one other question, Alyson, thinking back to improvement and lessons that you've learned and helped others with, what's one tip you would have for others about how to help make improvement simple, to not make it too, complex or intimidating? How can we keep it simple?
Oh, that's a great question. When I think about keeping things simple, I think about explaining things or being able to tell someone who does not work in your organization or your department about it, and then being able to understand it the first time. And so I think it doesn't, again, have to be boiling the ocean. If we have our eye continuously to learning and improving, then it can be smaller cycles and not boiling the ocean and keeping things in a way that says, take this home to your family. And if they understand it, it's clear enough. That's one little rule I like to use is don't be afraid to start and don't think that a small improvement is not good enough, because it is.
Well, and when that small improvement gets the ball rolling, that's where we start building momentum to really changing behaviors and changing the culture and getting better results.
It's that first domino, right, that helps tip the next one. So absolutely, it's, I think, most important to start and to learn from that action, and then to keep taking action.
Well, that's a great reminder, and I think we'll leave that as a great note to end on. So again, I really want to thank you, Alyson. Our guest has been Alyson Gordon from Duke University Health System. Again, if you're a new listener to the podcast, we want you to check out our past episodes, and you can also listen to Alyson's colleague Rhonda Brandon in episode 15 of the podcast, and hopefully we'll get to hear from other great people at Duke University Health System. So Alyson, thank you again. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Sure.